Okay.
Okay, welcome everybody to this Nepal Dialogue UK 15th monthly webinar. My name is David Gellner. I've been asked to chair this session. So we're bringing together people from all over the world, and I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Dr. Tina Shrestha. She is currently a lecturer at Hong Kong Shue University, as well as a research affiliate at Waseda University, and she did her PhD from Cornell. And out of that PhD came the book, which I had the pleasure of reviewing, called Surviving the Sanctuary City, Asylum Seeking Work in Nepali, New York. And it came out in 2023 from University of Washington Press. And it does absolutely what I think in this, especially in this day and age, anthropology should do, which is to mediate between the official stories and the bureaucracy and life as it's actually lived and the bureaucratic policies as they're actually experienced. So it's a kind of absolute model from that point of view. It's also a model from the point of view of what anthropologists call positionality. That is to say, it's self-consciously aware of the position of the ethnographer, the person doing the research in the field, doesn't sort of try to stand outside from an Olympian point of view and ignore the effect of the anthropologist on the field. And it does this in a very subtle and sensitive way, not in kind of a highly self-indulgent way that used to be a fashion some years ago. So it's a book that I thoroughly recommend to everybody who wants to try and understand what do these asylum seekers in New York actually experience, many of whom, and a lot of it, and one theme which you won't be surprised that goes through the whole book is the theme of dukkha and suffering, and both what can be said and what cannot be said. So it's very subtle from that point of view. And it's fair to say that Tina Shrestha is probably the only person who's actually done research on different parts of the Nepali diaspora, which is so important nowadays. This was really brought home to me a couple of years ago when I revisited Japan after 20 years. 23 years ago, there might have been 1,000 Nepalis in Japan, not more. Now, I don't know what the current estimated figure is, probably 200,000, maybe 300,000. I mean, you cannot, every single little corner shop that you go into in all Japanese cities, there's at least one Nepali standing behind the till. And when a Gora like me addresses them in Nepali, their jaw drops to the floor. They're totally astonished. Anyway, which is it's a good entry point. So anyway, enough from me. Tina, we look forward to your talk very much. Over to you.
Great. Everybody can hear me? Yes. Thank you, Dr. Gellner, for that very generous introduction. And I feel like you've already summarized what I'm going to talk about. So I'd also like to thank Dr. Krishna Adhikari for reaching out and his entire team at the Nepal Dialogue UK for organizing this webinar. Especially as someone from the diaspora and desiring to connect with diasporic communities elsewhere. This is very important platform, and thank you. I'm very grateful for being invited to share my work. And finally, I guess thank you to some of you who have joined us Saturday morning in the UK, I'm told, right? And afternoon, late afternoon in this part of the world, in Asia. Not sure anybody's from the US here, but so when Krishnaji and I spoke briefly last month, I think he asked me specifically to talk about Nepali, right? Nepali, my research on Nepalis in the US and Japan, and more importantly to make sure that the format of the talk is not a dry academic seminar. So I've tried my best, and if I see people dropping out, I guess then I'll get a hint. But so what I've prepared today, draws on my personal, actual previous and ongoing research, again on contemporary Nepali migration and diasporic communities, without dwelling too much on anthropological or specialized debates. So I weave together my personal and professional trajectory, as they are intricately connected to my research priorities. And, as Dr. Gellner also just mentioned, that it's part of, as scholars and research, why we're interested, has a deeper sort of existential questions, and aside from intellectual curiosities and what affects us. And so here's the outline of my talk today. So I've broadly divided into two sections, broad sections, literally mapping my own migration. So my reflection that considers this differently, situated experience of migration, legalization, and low-wage labor integration in these two contexts. This exercise of working through arrival, as I've labeled arrival 1 and arrival 2, is built again around my own experience of researching within the diaspora, living as a Nepali diaspora, first in the US, member of a diaspora in the US, and now in Asia, was in Japan, but now I'm currently in Hong Kong. But as a Nepali American anthropologist and scholar of Asian migrations, on one hand, this exercise of making Nepali American legible in East Asia is worthwhile because it has alerted me to overlapping and unequal legacies of US, Japanese, and British imperialism tied to forms of racialized, though differently constructed diasporic frames. On the other hand, the problem of defining, of course, Nepali American in Asia also itself lends to the destabilization of these racialized categories that do not necessarily cross national and cultural boundaries. For instance, in Japan, I was more either Nepali or American, and so it's very interesting because, and I say this as a joke also. Ever since I've left America, 10 years ago now, I've become more American, or I've identified by people in the diaspora as more American, right? And that has had impact on how I also research and what I see, what kind of questions, and how. So it's been quite an interesting journey so far. But as news, stories and anecdotes of Nepalis circulate across diaspora's public and digital sphere like this one, bringing into focus the intensity of connections among people in these distinct locations, attempting to keep them as part of one coherent narrative of Nepali diaspora, it seems fraught. And I will try not to do that. I mean, aside from many problems of universalizing a diasporic account from a particular location, the problem also lies in flattening unequal terms and conditions of migration, settlement patterns, return migration, displacements across different space and time. And there already exist, several books on Nepali diaspora, edited volumes. I'm sure there are more, but these are the English language books and edited volumes of some of the participants here today. That so my book, Surviving the Sanctuary City: Asylum-Seeking Work in Nepali, New York, joins this steadily growing sort of diasporic scholarship, Nepali diaspora scholarship. So, as a first-generation Nepali American with parents who immigrated to the US in the mid-1990s, to the American South, that is Kentucky, I grew up in predominantly white, working-class, suburban neighborhoods. The journey from Kathmandu to Kentucky was anything but smooth. During early years of settlement in America, my parents deliberated continuously on returning home. Home for them was Kathmandu, right? Still is. So the downward socioeconomic mobility, lack of healthcare, and financial instability had taken a toll on them. I mean, the term arrival is imprecise and always an approximate. But in my mind, arriving places are as physical and as psychosocial spaces, affirming our choices, however constrained, for embarking on a given journey in the first place. And as we all know, many much awaited arriving places seldom live up to our expectations and tend to lead to disappointments. But I think disappointment of these places are important. Most of all, the sense of never arriving, that unfinished realization. So for a long time in my mind, suburban life in Kentucky and the disappointments we experienced as a family stood in for the idea of America itself. It wasn't that our family could not afford food on the table or a roof under our head, but many myths and greatness of America that I had absorbed as a child in Kathmandu were being crushed one after the other. Kentucky, during high school and college years, seemed like a waiting place. As a young adult in small town America, then, I was also absorbing another powerful myth, right? American dream. And America as a land of opportunity. This myth fortified despite the lived circumstances of my family when I left home, Kentucky, this time. After graduating from college, I went to New York City, the greatest city and financial capital, not only of America, but also of the world. Well, at least at the time that I moved. So New York was where I was introduced to America. I recognized from television and movies as a teenager and young adult in Kentucky. And this place of arrival completely flipped my sense of who I could become in America. Just like a lot of us, a lot of Nepalis who travel to New York or settle down, right, decide to live there, restoring the myth of its greatness all over again. So one way New York City sort of held up this illusion for me of America or American dream was through my admission to Columbia University's master's program in liberal studies, South Asian studies. It was one of the first affirmations that I had arrived. But while in New York, I noticed obvious disjuncture between the courses I was taking at Columbia and, the lived realities of people who lived just a train ride away in Queens. And perhaps many of you have been to New York and know Jackson Heights, Queens. So in this New York, I was meeting people with shared experience of migration as my families, and growing up, in the American suburbs, not speaking mother tongue in public spheres, sort of families struggling with their unemployment, lack of health insurance, and this palpable fear of being policed, not only by authorities, but also colleagues, co-workers, right? Private citizens, basically. And this often unspoken and marginal experiences in the suburbs were right and center in Queens, New York. So in many ways, my research began long before I officially pursued a PhD in anthropology at Cornell. So, just maybe slightly longer background than you would have hoped, but that's how I arrived in New York, and so research sort of began officially. And so I'll give a little bit of detail on the book itself, the diaspora in Nepali, New York. It's kind of nice map that's also in the book. You have there's a enlarged version of Queens, Jackson Heights, Woodside, Sunnyside. These were all the neighborhoods, Nepali neighborhoods, and of course it's beyond that now, Brooklyn and elsewhere in the boroughs. Oh, sorry, I can't. Oh, there. So there, David already spoke of positionality, and thank you for that. But I was located in two specific the sites, or as anthropologists like to call it, right? Ethnographic context. One was Nepali grassroots workers' rights organization, Adhikar, in Woodside. Maybe some of you have heard of it. And Adhikar is a community center. It offered sort of variety of workers' rights related programs to Nepali speaking communities. And I say Nepali speaking communities because they're not all from Nepal, right? From Tibet, from India, North India, and Bhutan. So it's Nepali speaking communities and mostly working class families. So they provided information sessions, and I was volunteering as a English language facilitator here. So Adhikar also it continues to be influential in organizing, advocating, sort of mobilizing Nepalis around workers' rights issues mostly. So this was one context. And the second one was what I have categorized under US institutional spaces. This is the second ethnographic context where human rights agencies, law firms, private law firms, asylum offices, and immigration courtrooms, where I provided English Nepali interpretation legal interpretation. And here I was more of a participant interpreter. I mean, we can talk about positionality, reflexivity, if people are interested in Q&A session. So if Nepali New York then, or Nepali Queens neighborhoods stood at one extreme of this diaspora gathering, Nepalis in this context, right, asylum institutional spaces, navigated them with fear, ambivalence, and constant sort of anxiety. And despite the visible differences of these two locations where I was doing my research, people shared a common concern, right, for what they interpreted, and I gradually learned as their social world of dukkha, suffering, a substantial and enduring consequence of surviving rather than thriving in America. So statements like this, right, were very common. Every Nepali has the same dukkha in this country. So everyone, it's hard to make paper. Sorry, I can't. Okay, there. Second one. Yeah, it took me 2 years to make paper. I had to work hard. We suffered a lot. So basically, suffering, right, dukkha, and making paper started, becoming sort of, these are the two concepts that I also developed in the book, but I kept hearing in these spaces that I was researching. And the issue was, for me, wasn't that, is it a socially constructed phenomenon, the work of making paper and dukkha? Of course, as anthropologists, social scientists, we know that. But the larger or more important question is, what are its uses? Like, why are people saying it? What kind of demands, risks it entail for Nepalis traveling or going through these spaces, asylum offices, and just making their working and living, and how did it affect sort of larger community, migrant community? So these dialogical encounters, sustained engagement, and reflexive accounts of people in the diaspora helped me formulate this question that I elaborate in the book. How has legalization then come to be interpreted? And legalization in this case was asylum seeking, the work of asylum seeking or making paper. How has it come to be lived, interpreted, right, on the same continuum as other work, taking up people's time and labor? Because seeking asylum did not prevent people, right, from working or being or participating in this low-wage labor, sort of grueling work. And this basically is not a coincidence. So to give you a context, this was 9/11, post 9/11 context, decade, what I call post 9/11 decade. The research itself took place between 2009 officially to 2011, 12, and then sporadically 13, 14, basically until I left the country right before Trump. Yeah, or no, I think 2 years before, so 2015. So at the time, and it's kind of strange to be talking about this 15 years ago, right? 10 years, 15 years ago, and something similar is happening now. So everybody knows the post 9/11 decade, where the war on terror that was used, the rhetoric used not only to occupy places elsewhere, but also how it was then used to police migrant and communities, like racialized ethnic communities, criminalization of people, and sort of proliferation of anti-immigrant sentiments, and how it all kind of contributed to this, what I call interior immigration enforcement. And anthropologists of the US have written books about it, right? Jason De Leon. I mean, again, we can talk about this during discussion if people are interested, of sort of the suffering internal borders of the US, how it's policed sort of aggressively. And so Customs and Border Protection then directly became in charge of asylum decisions. So interestingly, right, it was around that decade, with post 9/11 decade, there were also pro-immigrant mass mobilization happening all across the US, major cities, and New York was obviously part of it. Legalization, so we're not criminals. That this was 2006, but Adhikar was also part of it. This is 2009. So May Day rallies, subsequent rallies, Nepalis, like, as diaspora, right? They're part of these pro-immigrant mass mobilization and rallies. And I'm there somewhere, don't have the picture here, but so community-based grassroots activism and institutional collaboration during this time resulted in a range of actually pushing liberal immigration policies. And that's the context where the pro bono legal services and assistance were offered by human rights agencies. And that is all gone now. The funding is gone. I mean, currently it's a different scenario, but I'm talking about this, the specific context of the book, when the political context, right? So these mass pro-immigration protests, above many things, was an attempt to demonstrate to the US state and the public, right, American public, that illegal aliens were not criminal aliens, but that they were hardworking migrants contributing to the US economy, US society, the kind of rhetoric I think we hear almost everywhere these days. So what it had done was that US immigration and asylum infrastructure then expanded in interpreting claimant, this asylum claimant deservingness in new ways. So many Nepalis were seeking asylum, or Nepali speaking people, because that's who I was interpreting for. So there are other groups as well. But the point is, the people, Nepali seeking asylum, as well as their identities were being constructed, right? Or they had to present themselves as hardworking, suffering, credible claimant workers. So if they presented themselves as that, they stood a better chance at obtaining asylum, being in the path on green card, and so forth. So regularization. And ultimately, the book, my research argues that these individualized suffering accounts that were being co-constructed in the asylum institutional spaces actually had a far-reaching impact on the community itself, the emergent Nepali diasporic community itself, sort of the visibility. And what it had done was the suffering community, extreme visibility of suffering. On the one hand, that was happening, but on the other hand, it was also this collective censorship, presenting community of members in a particular way. I mean, everywhere Nepali diaspora, places we are, there's always obviously differences and different opinions of what that Nepali identity should be. And so that's a different conversation. But the kind of collective censorship I'm speaking of here is, like we have to minimize that differences, like minimize our internal differences. So that aside from that differences, I'm also talking about not to be confrontational, right? Not to come under the radar of, well, ICE. I mean, so lay low. So from organizing activism and demanding rights to sort of having, people sort of self-policing, right? And certainly in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic and post-pandemic, governance, suffering, visibility also has continued to gain traction in the community. This is slightly pre-pandemic time. TPS, temporary protected status, was case in point, was a long battle, and Adhikar actually was also advocating for that. Different, if people have been following that news or what's happened now, it's it's a bit of a disaster now. So I moved away, but I'm in touch with community members and organizers. They've changed at Adhikar, at other places, and here we have some things have remained same. I think there's a community struggle. You see again this visibility of Nepali community out. In New York City, this is 2023, right? And the question for me still remains, how do you reconcile, right, with this, and of course, individual stories like reaching American Dream. We have Hari Bhandari, Tina Shrestha is sort of one is state delegate since 2019 and assembly member of New York since 2022. So, the examples of newly elected members, and it's great. And alongside you have, those of 100,000 Nepalis, right, taking all kinds of risk every year to not embark on their migration journey, but also it doesn't end once you enter different borders, and then you have obviously the borders as after you enter the country. So the book, my research basically, as a conclusion, is really an opening to discuss sort of this changing diasporic future, Nepali diasporic future, lying somewhere between this visibility and what I call suffering visibility then, and this collective censorship. And we can come back to this during discussion, but I'll now move on to the arrival number, like part two. I mean, I've obviously skipped several arrivals, but because I'm looking at Japan and comparing the case with Nepali case here, I'll go directly to Japan. So by the time I arrived in Japan in 2018, the prevailing condition among Nepalis in Japan was marked by the stark differences between the post-2015 Nepali student migrants and the earlier sort of, generation of labor migrants. And Keiko Yamanaka, among others, have a very good piece on sort of documenting this, like global warriors to global workers, and who are sort of mostly male, single male, working as in restaurants, and they're still there. That people, but now it's increasingly the student migration, another channel as student workers, and people who. Some of us who like numbers, like to see, and I think maybe this answers David's question about how many Nepalis are there now. So, another colleague, Dipesh Karel, who's a visual anthropologist in Japan, he's done amazing videos and documentaries. But here's the number of Nepalis where you have it's steadily increasing Nepalis. You can numbers speak themselves. This is 2016. So by 2015, there were over 55,000 Nepalis. These are registered, right? And census, we all know everywhere doesn't. Well, maybe in Japan's case, they're less likely to be undocumented or irregular status people. So not like the US, but perhaps this is more accurate. But according to 2018 Japan Student Service Organizations, Nepali international students accounted for the third highest group after Chinese nationals and Vietnamese. So this is 2018. This is the time that I showed up in Japan, I guess. and I'll tell you why I started looking at Nepali student workers and student migrants and not other groups in a bit. But so these Nepali students, student workers, they study and work in the urban and metropolitan areas, including Tokyo, Kanagawa, Okinawa, Osaka. I mean, all these places. And this is an interesting also visual of by another colleague, Masako Tanaka. Maybe some of you know Tanaka Sensei. She actually works on first generation, second generation, I guess you could call Nepali Japanese, right? Migrant families and youth. So the blue pie here, you see it's like the dependent visa. This is 2020 data. And, and here's the student, right? On people on student visa, registered Nepalese. So at the time, and this is 2018, as a then, back then, as a newly arrived Nepali American again in Japan. So you can imagine my surprise that neither of the dominant categories, credible claimant, workers, or hardworking, deserving migrants, they were not, these were not legible frame of reference to look at Nepalese lives and livelihood in Japan, clearly. And additionally, I had to grapple with my own positionality. Right? So for Nepalis in Japan, I was either Nepali or an American whose reverse migration for them from the US to Japan was a recurrent source of their curiosity and confusion. Somebody actually once in Japan asked me, did you leave America to come to Japan because of their gun culture, right? Gun violence? And it's not incorrect too, but you can imagine sort of the kind of images and imagination that people do have in different locations, diasporic locations, whether it's Nepali American or Nepali Australian. So that was very interesting. And at the same time, in wider Japanese society, I was constantly being mistaken, right, for a foreign student, like student worker. And initially I was like, oh my God, everybody thinks I'm a student. I must look young, but that was not the case. So, then I had to investigate, right? Why and how this Nepali student workers, so how were they becoming sort of visible, or and they were predominantly employed in convenience stores, in Family Mart. So these are the like 7-Eleven, Lawson, all of these, all across the metropolitan cities and elsewhere in Japan. But aside from that, I learned slowly through my research, they're also employed in bento factories, like manufacturing, hospitality, and increasingly, people in Nepal would know more about this in the care work. Right? Yeah. So a few then anecdotes, right, from Japanese, Nepali student workers that I met in Japan and interviewed subsequently. And the context here is, well, COVID. So it is particularly stressful because there's no class and no work. We are having a difficult time just surviving. How can we pay tuition and send money home? A student enrolled in vocational college in Tokyo reflected on the everyday impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on students like herself during the early months of the first state of emergency in April 2020. I could have been in the list of those students whose visa renewal application got denied last year. I had just stopped working overtime because I suddenly got sick. I guess I got lucky. Yet another enrolled in Japanese language school in Okinawa shared in a telephone interview as he made sense of his absurd situation. Sickness had prevented his possible detention. So during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic in November 2020, student visa of 78 students enrolled in a Japanese language school or JSL Academy in Naha, Okinawa was withdrawn by the Fukuoka Regional Immigration Bureau. So for working beyond maximum allowed hours, which is 28 hours per week, I don't know if that has changed. I don't think it has. But the open secret is that you cannot live in any parts of Japan by working 28 hours a week, formally. So people have 2 or 3 part-time jobs while they're attending these language schools, vocational colleges. So while news like this regularly feature among diasporic sort of social media, online newspaper during COVID-19 Japan, nowhere was this case reported in the mainstream Japanese or English language, left, right-leaning outlets or social media. In fact, students in Okinawa, when I interviewed them, were surprised that I had not heard of this case of this JSL Academy. So the JSL, I think they lost their license, and there's a whole politics around, one institution, a language school shuts down, then the other one opens. So again, we can discuss that during Q&A. But this case of JSL and the accounts of Nepali student workers enrolled in countries, language schools and vocational colleges, so it eliminated for me at least like this migration infrastructural, like reconstruction going on, right, during the COVID-19. But it was already happening long before COVID-19 pandemic. As we all know, Japan, it's no secret that it has long been criticized for its restrictive immigration policy among more liberal democracies. So countering this dominant narrative, Japanese government had issued its newest, much anticipated, supposedly liberal, and improved immigration policy, implementing the specified skill visa in April 2019. It was publicized all over, in mainstream Nepali newspapers. So designated to recruit less, whatever that means, skilled workers from South and Southeast Asian countries over the next 5 years. The migration policies were centered around filling labor shortage sectors. 14 sectors, I don't know the list of everything, but agriculture, hospitality, food manufacturing, and care, as we keep hearing this, aging Japan. So, but the policy, as we also know, had coincided with the outbreak of pandemic, and the JSL case and people that I interviewed were part of that. They were talking about what had happened. There's no work, there's no class at the time. So in this context, The demand for low-wage foreign workers in the labor shortage sectors or industries was being abruptly offset, or so it would seem. But what had happened is this pragmatic dysfunction of pandemic governance internally had minimal impact, really, on enduring labor shortage because it restructured. So labor reserve, like students in from the metropolitan cities across Japan were then transferred, right, to rural Japan, wherever the labor shortage was. And that was a very an interesting time to be in Japan. Uh, Personally, I also went on maternity leave. The COVID-19 2020 was a sort of a sort of hazing for me, for I guess for all of us, for different reasons. So the case of, again, Nepali students at that JSL Academy whose visas were withdrawn, and they actually found other work later on. But it illustrated overall this growing but less really understood features of education intermediaries and migration brokerage setup. Not only in Nepal, I had initially looked at the labor brokerage or sort of facilitating and conditioning migration, like low-wage migration from Nepal to Malaysia, and also how similarly education intermediaries were doing it for Japan. But after living in Japan, or having lived in Japan, you realize that Nepalis on student visa, they were saying that Japanese language competency neither guarantees better employment nor entrance into higher education, like tertiary education. Rather, their flexibility to work long hours, like the students I had interviewed and made friends where I was living, all the people who were doing third shifts in Family Mart and all the combinis, working weekends, overtime. So that's what made them desirable to employers. So at the same time, this is what was happening, right? Education intermediaries, and this is in Japan with the Nihongo Gakko, which are language schools, Japanese language schools, and vocational colleges. They became part. They didn't only play a commercial role in recruiting students for their schools, but also they're part of the regulatory framework within Japanese immigration system, so to speak. So that's what my recent research. So if people are interested, I'd be happy to share the research, that article that came out last year, maybe 2 years ago. But really looking at the regulatory role of these schools, language schools, and conditioning, facilitating foreign student mobility within the country in Japan. So Nihongo Gakko, or sorry, Japanese language schools, that is how they channel foreign student workforce to labor shortage sectors, but they also are linked with the vocational colleges. And in some ways, it was really then contributing to this casualization of student workforce or reserve. And educationally channeled labor migration, as one of my colleagues in Japan has a book on talking about Chinese students being channeled to low-wage sectors, and something similar is happening with Nepali. So there's already, it's like a template, right? So it's not just Nepalis, but here the Nepali students fitting into that role now. So I left Japan in 2023, and this is as of 2024, then Nepali students, so this is the Nepali foreign students, they are now the second largest group, right, after Chinese nationals. So, from 2018, if they were third largest student population, now they're the second largest, highest group of international students in Japan. And my colleagues, I'm sure in Japan, are researching on this and have more updated reports on, also alongside its dependent visas and families. So then that, along with family, you have children, right? And then access to healthcare, education, so similar questions, issues come up as well in the case of Japan. But I'm not in Japan now. But so the Japanese dream. Then what about the Japanese dream? Right? So here's this is an interesting documentary again by same colleague in the Karel. He has made another documentary called Japani. So from one village in Nepal, I forget which part, but all the parents are missing, right? Or parents are not there, and the grandparents are raising kids. And this is not unfamiliar to I'm sure a lot of our Nepali colleagues, participants here today. So what about the Japanese dream, right? So it is distinct from the American dream, with which I began this talk, and the question of arrival. So again, there's this hardworking student workers in Japan trying to reach their dream. So the question of both American and let's say Japanese dream is around question of legalization or regularization, aspirations of upward social mobility, education, financial stability, the dynamics of disappointment in these contexts, these two contexts, that it's not identical. And I think there is a danger in kind of saying that they're similar, they're same, because Japanese dream then is not a replica of the American dream. And there's a danger sort of erasing this distinct form of disappointment that, or the form that disappointment takes in these two contexts. I mean, for instance, the diasporic visibility in Japan is not associated with asylum seeking per se, although making paper a regularization, right, as happening is well underway in a very specific context there. Likewise, the censorship in the Nepali communities in Japan is not linked or explicitly linked to interior immigration enforcement in the same way that it's unfolding under ICE now in the US. The language schools and vocational colleges then are put in place, right? Or they are in place to police, survey, and discipline student workers as they redistribute their labor across the labor shortage industries in the country. In other words, the palpable fear and anxiety around visibility and growing censorship has felt intimately familiar to me while I was living there. So I mean, that these are the sort of questions I have. But the project's aim, the diaspora or Nepali diaspora in a comparative perspective and transregional connections, is to explore and elaborate on these diasporic interconnections by looking into the unequal terrain of the contemporary geopolitics within which diverse migration, integration experience, and legalization unfold as they contentiously sort of come to form or bear in the formation of Nepali New York, as you saw, Nepali Japan, or Nepali Hong Kong for me now. Attuning to these differently situated histories of migration and disappointment that came before our own, then allow, I think, for a better understanding of why arrival may have eluded us or how waiting could not have been avoided at any cost. So I will leave you with some questions, or I know I'm not supposed to bring up questions. People have questions, but some discussion question is this. These are the two. There you go. So basically, can we imagine Nepali or the Himalayan diasporic consciousness without flattening differences, differently situated lived experience of migration, racialized integration, immobility, labor, education? And if so, then what alternative frame of reference can allow to do that, to meaningfully explore these interconnections, as well as disappointment that I just spoke about across these locations? I mean, in this case, I speak of Nepali diaspora in the US and Japan. You could also take Nepali Australians, like students, and Nepali Japanese. So my point is, if the diasporic locations themselves become frame of reference, not replacing homeland questions and belonging, but perhaps in addition to that, what kind of new narratives and methods can we explore, and can we meaningfully really understand? Or I mean, I have some thoughts on it, why and how. I mean, as an anthropologist and somebody interested in just sort of transnational feminist theoretical frameworks, I have some ideas, but I'd like to hear what people have to say, or if you have other questions, I'd be happy to answer. And I'd invite other people to also actually discuss, because we're all, I mean, most of us are in diasporic locations. So, Thank you very much
Thank
for
you,
your
Tina.
time.
Thank you very much. Um, yes, that raises lots and lots of really interesting questions, and we're starting to get some in the chat. But let me start. Can I just start in a way? Let me, as I said, abuse my chair's privilege, just to push you for clarification about the Japanese dream, because
Mm.
if we put the UK, USA, Australia, New Zealand at one end of the spectrum as kind of diaspora locations where making paper, regularizing, becoming citizens on is possible. There is a path to that, and we put the Gulf countries, at the other end, where however many, doesn't matter how many decades you're there, you'll never be a citizen. Um, I'm still struggling to understand the Japanese situation. You could, and maybe because of lack of time, kind of skimmed over that a bit. Uh, is it? Are there any? I mean, I imagine there might be one or two cases of Nepali diaspora people who've managed to make the path to citizenship, but I'm guessing that it's much much smaller than the percentage of those who, as I say, in those other the countries at the other end of the spectrum. But am I right? Is it possible? Is it genuinely part of the Nepali diaspora's Japanese dream that they will become Japanese citizens?
Yes, I mean, yes. There are so families, right? Actually, including my own relatives, there
Yeah.
are like Nepali Japanese who, like a Newari Japanese, let's say, they either speak Japanese or Newari, for instance, right? So the kids of second, you're right, small number, very small, like number of people. So the Japanese dream, to clarify, yes, it was a documentary that a colleague of mine made, but mostly centered around students' dream, like why,
So what
Japanese
is their
dream.
dream? Is their dream to just make a lot of money and go home? Or is their
And
dream to
or
one day become
because
Japanese?
for this one, for the student workers, it's really to make money and send money home. And one end of the spectrum. But I also met students who had gone through college, grad school, and wanted to stay. But then the legalization is not straightforward, like you correctly pointed out, with a lot of. So it does depend on immigration policies, what kind of immigration policies are there in place, and is a student visa transferable to dependent visa? It's not. So it's much more complicated there. You're
Can be
right.
done. It sounds so there are one or two cases where there is it's not totally excluded that just because
No.
you are
So
Nepali by
you
origin, you can become a Japanese citizen.
you get I don't know about the citizenship, but you do get work visa, the prolonged sort of contract based, right? So from student visa to work visa. But I'm not 100% sure if all
Children
of the
who are
students,
born
the
there,
majority, um,
children
and
do children who,
no,
if a child children who are born there do not automatically get. I mean,
they do not. No,
because you have to have what is it called this household document,
you don't
koseki. If
automatically
you haven't
become.
got that koseki, you're not a Japanese citizen, right?
Yeah,
So
you automatically don't just because you're born
like,
there.
let
So
me
your
find.
parents have
Okay,
to
I'm going to
have.
abuse my privilege one more time. This is a very touchy question, um, but some Nepalis can pass as Japanese and some cannot. So maybe I certainly remember going into a bank in 2003 and seeing a man there. I thought, gosh, I know that man. He looks exactly like so and so Dakwa that I know from Patna. And so Newas and some other Janjatis can pass as Japanese. Many other Nepalis cannot. And do you
Mm,
see that fact as playing a role?
yes. The racialization works very differently in Japan, and yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, the South Asianization of certain Nepalis and not others. Um, yes, I think it does play a role, but also then it's you have not just the way in which people are racialized, but also the socioeconomic background, the all of that big feature, right, um, in how people are perceived and
It
how,
helps if
yeah,
you're more in a more middle class profession, is what you're saying.
exactly. And I think it's everywhere is the case, not only in Japan, but
Right.
I think that
Right.
happens everywhere. So, but that certainly, and people have one of my informants basically said, "Why don't you take out your nose
Yeah.
ring?"
And you'll
Because you
be
could, because I was wearing mask, and a lot of Nepalis did not think I was Nepali. Hey? well, they thought I was Japanese, then because I could pass, and it was also during COVID. So then once I start speaking, then they're like, "Oh, then are you American though? But you're not quite Nepali either." That's beside the point. But so of course, remarks like that. If you take out in people saying,
What are you
they
doing
had.
with a puli as a Newar anyway? But
That's
anyway, we
a
don't need to
separate question.
then have a question.
But yeah. So now that your question about, I think the racialization, the degrees of ways in which people are racialized, and along with the kind of social hierarchies that already exist, gender hierarchies play a big role. Correct. So.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm sure we could have a long chat, but maybe this is not the place. Let's Deepak G, if you could write your question in the chat, which I think is the correct way to go about this. Let's start. The first question we've got, and this is a somewhat vague question from Uttam. What types of adhikar has been provided to Nepali citizens by US government at present? I mean,
Yeah.
if you're a Nepali citizen, you have no rights, right? You're not supposed to work, So anyway, do you want to speak to that? What rights do Nepali citizens have from the US government?
I mean, I guess it depends. Is it people as Nepali citizens? Are they on student visa? Are they on work visa? What kind of visa?
It depends on what kind of visa. Is the answer, right? But as a student, on a student visa, do you have a right to work up to a certain number of hours in the US?
I think in the US you have the OPT as right, and then also work study. And this is I'm speaking from for people also long time ago. I don't know how much that has changed with all the H-1B being completely sort of taken taken out, and a lot of other immigration rules that are affecting the student visas. So I'm not 100% sure about the student visas but the OPT I think still is there for 1 year. And,
so what is the OPT?
Sorry, optional practical training, like the people used to get for 1 year. I think it's still in place.
Was that a post-study visa?
So people to find work right while they're there. And I think I'm not the right person. So it would people who have actually gone as international student to the US would be
people
better
need
person
to speak to that. I mean, the basic answer is our migration regimes change everywhere all the time. So, the correct advice is talk to a legal specialist. Do not rely on the grapevine, because governments change the rules. And unless you're a full citizen, your rights can be changed and taken away at any time.
Well, I'll just add to that what's unfolding in the US, even so US citizenship is slowly being healing out of the naturalization issue.
Same in the UK. Same in the UK. If you happen to be a brown person whose parents came to this country, you can, in other circumstances, as we've seen with this unfortunate young woman who went off and married an IS fighter, which her citizenship was removed, even though she was born in the UK. So yes, citizenship is negotiable. So Krishna has asked, defining the Nepali diaspora might be difficult because it spans both a nation and a language. For the millions of Nepali speakers who have no legal tie to the state of Nepal, i.e. Bhutanese, to what extent does a shared language actually translate into practical solidarity? Can we truly speak of a global Nepali diaspora if the primary link is linguistic rather than civic? I mean, just on the ground in America, to what extent do the Bhutanese, Nepali-speaking Bhutanese, and the Nepalis coming from Nepal, to what extent do they actually stand together or interact, or even are friends with each other?
I mean, I can answer that question in many different ways, because even when you're saying Nepali speaking from Nepal, well, they're Newars, they're Gurung, they're Tamang. So how many, even among just who say the Nepalis or the first language is Nepali, necessarily don't stand in together. So I'm not so 100% sure with the Bhutanese if there's also similar kind of diversity within Bhutanese Nepalis as well. So class. Do they all speak just Bhutanese and Nepali, or are there other languages that act as a form of bridging that gap? But I mean, if the question is about with the organization that I was volunteering at the time, at Adhikar. It was one of the first kind. It just reached 20 years, I think. Right? Yeah, 2025, 26. But anyway, so they were serving Nepali speaking. The reason they gathered around, say, Nepali speaking communities is because a lot of, they were Bhutanese Nepalese, also Tibetan Nepalese, or Nepalis from India, right? Nepali speaking Indian. That's one of the reasons that people had gathered Adhikar or organization like that. But as we all know, in different aspect locations, and one of the not necessarily an issue, but the diversity, right? Like hundreds of organizations. I mean, here in Hong Kong, I'm slowly learning there are lots and lots of Nepali organizations, and even you can't just say caste-based, regional based, or ethnicity based. There's several Gurung organizations. There's several Newar organizations. There's not just one. As is, I suspect, in the UK. Right?
So yeah.
So I think purely, I'm not sure if purely language based or community exist. But I mean, it's an interesting thought. Like, if global Nepali diaspora is a linguistic link rather than civic. Yeah, not my answer. I'm not so sure, especially for the Bhutanese Nepalis.
There is, a global organization that claims to speak for all Nepalis, the NRN movement.
That, yes. And then I didn't speak of the intergenerational, right? So, you can be Newari. You have intergenerational sort of, languages that are at play as well. So, it's playing out differently in Hong Kong, for instance, between Cantonese and Mandarin, English. So in the US, you have second, third generation kids, of course, like their mother tongue is maybe English than Newar or other ethnic languages. So, I mean, that we haven't quite talked about it, but I think it's much more complicated than to say language will,
Language will bring you together, for sure. Absolutely. Yes, lots that could be said about that. Okay, we have a question. We've got questions piling up now. So Mina is asking, Nepali migrants in Japan, have they gone directly to Japan or taken GCC or career working experience before they moved to Japan?
So the ones that I interviewed, they're mostly student workers. So they'd come not through, Korea. But so the ones I interviewed, but there are people, or rather Japan was seen as a step to go elsewhere, right? To go to Australia, or not so much US, but and also like previous generation of Nepalis, not the student migrants, but a lot of the cooks, the people with families, they have had, there's also Gorkha connection. I forget this, beside Kyoko Yamanaka, somebody else had written about it too, the Gorkha connection. So I think from Japan, people have moved to New York. I know that. But the ones I interviewed, Korea didn't figure so much. But I'm sure there are, just because I didn't meet people that happen to come, from Korea or Gulf countries, that they don't. I wouldn't say they don't. They're not there. They probably are.
So Bob Boral has asked, do you have job seekers allowance and free medicals in the US and Japan for migrants, including refugees and students? And if so, are they as attractive as in the UK? So currently the UK government is offering £40,000 to those illegally living in the UK if they go back to their home country. So that's two different questions. So first question is about what do the migrants get in terms of free medical allowance or job seekers allowance in the US and Japan?
So in the case of the US, you had Obamacare, right? And then Adhikar was also supporting that, and it was around the same time. Unfortunately, with what's happening right now, like a lot of those are, the allowances. It's not that these allowances aren't there, but in my experience of researching and talking to people, so a lot of people, do not know, or if communities that are being heavily policed or surveyed, they are less likely to go seek, right? And I think it's true probably in the UK as well. Yeah. So if they're undocumented, it's not that they may not have access. They have access, but to get to it,
they're afraid to
legally, legally it's there. But again, it's like this brilliant move that I think a lot of countries do, that people that's where the self-policing migrant policing comes up, right? So even census data, the reason that undocumented people are less likely to report that they're there, and census data, especially in the US, is always lower than what it says, right? For not just for Nepalis, but
the policing is every
so,
country. The policing is pushed down. University in this country, university departments have to check on their students when I took my 89-year-old mother to the hospital, the first question is, are you a British citizen, before it could even get past the first stage, etc. Yeah, so it's that kind of policing is happening everywhere. Sorry,
yeah,
did I interrupt? Was there something else you wanted to say on the last question?
No.
Okay, so let's go to Marilena Frizonis. Marilena is an expert on the Newa diaspora in London, and thank you for this fascinating talk. Picking up on something you mentioned at the end of the talk, could you tell us more about the way in which different kinds of Nepali ethnic groups, I'm particularly interested in Newa migrants, experience their stay in Japan? In what way are the experiences of different groups different or similar? And what is the role of local ethnic organizations in providing support and advice? So this is specifically about Japan. You've said a little bit about it. You've sort of hinted about your Newa cousins who speak Nepali and got long permanent residence.
The short answer is a colleague of mine, Masako Tanaka. She's really looking into the Nepali migrants and families in Japan, and she's more in tune, sort of with all the different ethnic organizations. Because my stay in Japan mostly coincided with the COVID-19 pandemic and immediate and post-pandemic governance, and then I became a new mother, a parent. So, my my own mobility was very restricted, and people I'd known, because I also went to Japanese language school later on, and I met a lot of Nepalis, and all these in this sort of konbinis or convenience stores. So, I just spoke to people. So they weren't necessarily part of ethnic groups and ethnic organizations, but there are different ethnic. And from what my cousins tell me in Osaka is that there are obviously several Newa organizations, Guru organizations, and I'm not so sure if their experience or stay in Japan kind of differ in terms of their ethnicities as much as the time that they were in Japan, and the laws, right? So kind of immigration laws that were there. So for instance, in early years of sort of student visa, when it opened up for Nepalis, they were going to higher education, tertiary education, and then there are several, right, graduates from Japan and returned to Nepal, and not as like a mass student visa. So I'm talking about last 5-6 years. It's a different generation, right, of kids or students going to Japan. So their experience, I don't know how much of that are similar or kind of draw on ethnic lines, if that answers your question. So to me, it's mostly the immigration laws and policies during certain moment in Japan, and of course in Nepal, what kind of laws were there and why. Because if cook visa or the visa to work visa, contract visa was one way, and then suddenly that stopped, then student visa became more readily available. Then you had all the education intermediaries and sort of facilitating that for it. I'm not sure if it's divided into particular ethnic groups. So but yeah, I wasn't really involved in the ethnic, how do I say this, ethnic, linguistic, regional. I mean, I go to all of these, but I don't commit to any. Because I've grown up doing that in the US, and when there were one or two, and I think.
Now you need to get one of your graduate students to map it for you, and
so yeah. But I would be interested, Meredina. Yeah, if you, I mean, I can also. I'd be happy to connect you to Tanaka Sensei. She's very much involved in all the ethnic organizations and communities that she's. Yeah, she's Japanese who speaks Nepali.
Krishna has added a point about the diaspora is more of a comment than a question, but pointing out that yes, you have all these different subgroups within the Nepali diaspora in the UK, but there are also
Mm,
there are forums in which they all come together as the new Nepali diaspora, but the Bhutanese get left out, if you see what I mean, as
ah,
the old diaspora,
interesting.
the people who left, as it were, before the 1960s or whatever, and left Nepal, they're not included somehow. I mean that's interesting because I sort of imagine if the Bhutani Nepali were in the UK were to kind of organize themselves and create an organization, I sort of imagine they would be included if they sought to be, but maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe the nation state container is so powerful that they would be excluded. I don't know. Um,
Mm. So is there, and I have one question about the UK actually. So when you say the new Nepali diaspora, this is UK, context of UK,
right, right.
and are they more like so Bhutanese Nepalis coming? Are they also just through the resettlement program like the
Yes,
US
yeah,
had?
but it wasn't. I mean, partly the thing is there aren't that. Maybe they haven't got the critical mass. UK did not take that many. I don't know how many there are. Maybe 10,000. I wouldn't think more than that. It's not like the US where there's 60 or 80,000 of them, or
Mm,
Australia where I think there were larger numbers. So it may be that there simply aren't enough of them to create a. But I think it also goes back to what you were saying in the talk and in your book about strategies of silence. There are certain
mm,
groups for whom it is strategic to keep your head down and not publicize. Whereas we have, of course, in the UK, what we have is what you don't have in the US is we have this very large and visible for ex-Gurkha population, and for them,
yes.
they are very publicly, making us taking a stance, saying, "Look, we are the good immigrants. We are the ones who fought for the country. We will march in our uniforms with our medals on Armistice Day." We are very prominently saying we are loyal to Britain. We are loyal to the Queen, or now the King, as it now is. So they're making a very public statement. And there are other groups, of course, of which I guess Bhutanese is probably one, where they don't wish to draw attention to themselves so much. And yeah. Um,
Okay. But just to add to that with the ex-Gurkha connection, because really I'm in Hong Kong now and I'm
right.
speaking to a lot of people and taking just life histories and understanding how sort of their connection or what I call the Gurkha framework. And it's obviously slowly opening up leads that can only be actually followed up in the UK. So there's another example of you have the you need to talk about the Gurkha connection in Malaysia and Southeast Asia, in Hong Kong, then the
Right.
UK. So that's yeah, future research or um, but interesting.
Okay, we've got more questions coming in. So
Okay, do
Kushi
we have
Limbu
time?
asks, does your paper propose A, any intellectual frameworks, or B, policy recommendations aimed at addressing the complexities of the outward migration from Nepal? Blimey. Keep it big.
Yeah,
Go
it's
for the big
very
ambitious questions. Would you
right.
like in one or
Uh,
two sentences to address those two big questions?
Sure, broad questions. I did talk about that I wasn't going to make it a very academic, dry talk, but in the book, of course, I use the framework of U.S. Anthropology and suffering asylum literature on that. For the diaspora, it's not a paper as much as a sort of a beginning of the project on that sort of comparative framework for me. And as I mentioned at the end of the talk, that mostly transnational sort of feminist frameworks, or transnational diasporic lives framework that I'm looking into. Um, so that those would be so far just broad frameworks and no policy recommendation as such. As I said, it's not a complete paper yet, but looking at research that I've completed in the two contexts and how they speak to each other. So, and I have, yes, if this was a more sort of academic talk, then I have things to say about South Asian diaspora, the limits and the possibilities of using South Asian diaspora, and why I actually haven't used it, even in the book, or kind of why US immigration asylum framework or that credibility question of credibility and suffering that to me, spoke more or lens to look at Nepali visibility rather than South Asian. Sometimes South Asian framework or of diasporic framework can be dominating and has its own ways in which it can erase or silence, right? Minoritized South Asians, their experience, especially in the US. So, yeah, I would just say that. But yeah, thank you for that question.
It's interesting. I mean, very often that is that message of anthropology, I'm afraid. Things are more complicated than they seem. Okay, let's go on to the next question from, again, Madalena has come back. In my experience of sporadic contact with the Nepali diaspora in Japan, the way in which their presence is perceived runs through two different narratives: a local fascination for Nepal and a generalized discrimination against South Asian migrants. Were these narratives something that you came across when you talked to Nepali students? So that sort of slightly kind of two contradictory narratives. And I think it's true.
No, absolutely.
The Japanese are fascinated by Nepal, and they do, partly as the birthplace of the Buddha, partly because it's mountainous, for various reasons, I think.
No, absolutely. And something I think initially when I did, when I was in Japan and meeting people, also as an anthropologist, depending on where you're trained, how you're trained, sort of the American anthropology, who you consider, or American anthropologists who doing research on Nepal, or Nepal anthropology by Americans differ from Nepal anthropology done by French scholars, let's say French anthropologists. So similarly, the Japanese have their own, like Ishii and I forget their names now, but scholars who are anthropologists, their frame of reference. I'm speaking more in terms of the academic sort of trajectory, or how Nepal anthropology is built, right? How Nepal's anthropology and studies in Japan or in Japanese understanding and sort of imagination of Nepal. So they vary, but this is it's absolutely, with talking to people, you did get that sense of that kind of conflicting. I wouldn't say conflicting, but really they both tell an interesting story of it on its own, and then you sort of push and say, so why this narrative kind of comes or foregrounds at this particular point, and the other one kind of recedes in the background, and then when is that other moment where the other one takes over? And I think we talked about different political moments, immigration laws and policies, and not only in Japan, but also in Nepal, and what kind of sort of boundaries are being created of the Nepali-ness also then determines how people are perceived. And
I think it's true, isn't it? Isn't it true that, I mean, Japan probably favors migration from Nepal if they're going to have, I mean, this is something we haven't explicitly mentioned, but Japan has a falling population. I mean, they're going through a demographic crash. They're a couple of decades possibly ahead of most developed countries in terms of their population is falling. They desperately need the labor for all kinds of things, but as you mentioned, from care homes and hospitals and restaurants. So if they're going to have migration from anywhere, they probably, they don't like foreigners generally, but there's a hierarchy of foreigners, and probably Nepalis are preferred to some of the alternatives, if you see what I mean.
The South Asians, how it's categorized. Yes, correct. And then it also then points out, right, where my example of, somebody saying, why didn't you take out your nose ring? And then you'd pass for more. The desirable South Asian, then, so there's definitely that desirable, undesirable South Asian. And that in that sense, how is that then affecting the Nepali community? And the question earlier by somebody who asked, right, if you're from different ethnic groups, then how do their experience differ? Then that answers this too, correct? So if you're perceived as the South Asian versus the similar to more Japanese. So the racialization works very interestingly in Japan. I've noticed.
Different from Europe, different from
US case, because I haven't lived in Europe to kind of see how it actually works or affects on Nepalis per se. But there's something definitely to explore more. And there's actually not an anthropologist, somebody actually looks at the South Asian minorities, or the discrimination of South Asians, and mostly sort of non-Nepalis. Um,
In the Japanese context, you're talking about.
in Japanese context, yes. In Japanese context, I think she made a movie recently too. So yeah, there's, sorry, I can't, I'm
That's all
forgetting.
right.
But short answer is yes. I, definitely did come across students who did talk about that difference, right? On the one hand, you have the Nepali diaspora, Nepali students getting jobs and being channeled into not necessarily desirable jobs either. Yes, you can come live here, work, but so, um, at your own, yeah, the, a lot of disappointments basically that come along with being a desirable population to in the workforce. So yeah.
And so maybe this is the last question. And except I know Deepak Chandra wanted to ask a question, but he hasn't written it in the chat. Anyway, Ranjita Didhal says, "Thank you for this talk. As a second generation," and this is bringing back to you because you raised the point about generation, which is so important in diaspora population.
Yeah.
Thank you for this talk. As a second generation person of Nepali origin living in London, I'm observing many forms of Nepali communities in London, especially those who choose to self-define, readily mix and blend cultures and contemporary practices, UK and Nepal, especially the younger generation. Young people I'm meeting in London are very agile, dynamic, and quote creating their own identities. And they have a very different experience from their parents, the first generation, which of course is a kind of cliche of migration studies, going back to the old American sociology studies of Poles in Chicago and so on. That the first generation is very different from the second generation. The second generation is is desperately embarrassed by their parents and the fact that their parents speak with a funny accent, and the parents are working incredibly hard. The second generation, they're much more assimilated. They speak the language properly. But they're embarrassed by their parents. And I remember once I gave a talk on the radio. This is going back 10, 15 years now, maybe 15 years. And a Nepali man from East London, came up to me to thank me. He said, "After listening to that radio talk of yours, my son stopped making fun of me because he realized that he was falling into a pattern, a kind of sociological pattern, which is so common." And then, of course, the third generation is the one, they no longer speak the language, but they're desperate to recover the culture, and they go on special courses and they go back to the homeland and they try to kind of recover their identity. I mean, this is an American pattern. It doesn't necessarily translate to other places. Anyway, I don't know if you want to comment on that from your.
No, thank you. Yeah, for that. We'll get the generational question, and I think David, you're absolutely right. In America, it is that now the third generation. Like we're seeing
It's the
third generation of Nepalis, or like my nieces and nephews, and that generation of kids, yes, who may not speak the language, but they're taking classes, right? Sunday Nepali classes, and even Newari, right? Some kids, actually, my whole friends in Kentucky, now they have kids. The Newari kids are speaking Newari, right?
Yeah.
And it's happening in that sense. But so in Japan, because it's not a solid and a mass sort of Japanese Nepali, or at least I am not aware of it. So again, I have to look into that. But how much of that second generation is like a mass presence there, I'm not so sure. It's not. So in Japan's case is again slightly different, and it's also by design. I would say, right? Immigration by design, that you can. And US is, I think, falling in the same trap now.
I mean, that's my experience with Japan, is that, the two, I mean, this is just anecdotal evidence, but the two Newa friends that I know who were totally fluent in Japanese, and who's, one was, maybe you know her, Shobana Bhattacharya, who works for the Japanese embassy in Kathmandu. She went as I think 16 or 17-year-old, because she won the Nepal national kanji competition by the Japanese embassy, got a visit to Japan, stayed, ended up doing a PhD at Kanazawa University, married, found the only sort of Vajracharya boy in Japan, married him, but she's come back. There was no way to stay forever. And likewise, another friend from Patan Shakya, his family were completely similar, but very much in the way you described. Basically, the two languages at home were Newa and Japanese, but he could come back. I don't think there was a way to stay permanently. So anyway,
But sorry, I just
Yeah,
want to add something to was it Ranjita, Dita?
yeah,
Yeah, just to bring it back to the connections, the diasporic frames of reference I mentioned earlier. I think it is very interesting and important also like, for this generation, or new generations, third generation of kids in the diaspora. For I'm learning like in Hong Kong, the second, third generation, I guess Nepali Hong Kongers who were influenced by hip hop culture, and the artists. I was following her work, and so it's not just so that frame of reference is beyond just the nationality, also, right? So it's not just the Nepalis in Europe, in the UK or Australia, America, what they're doing, but also the kind of sort of contemporary pop cultures elsewhere, like K-pop, for instance, like how that has, you could say, Nepali kids in the 20s are more well versed in K-pop and J-pop, or the dramas that are outside of what the Nepali generations before watched. So of course this also has social media and influence and intensity of those connections and different platforms people are using. So that generation connection is quite fascinating to.
I mean, I think
Yeah,
in Hong
you
Kong,
you
you'll probably already reach possibly fourth or even fifth generation there because people Nepalis have
yeah,
been in Hong Kong for such a long time.
exactly. And then but at the same time also sort of invisibilized in a very different way that I'm slowly learning. Um, yeah, third, fourth generation, it's a much longer history actually. And they're identified as non-Chinese ethnic minorities, right? In I guess since the handover, I'm not so sure. So 1997 or 2008, those years signify something completely different for Nepali Hong Kongers than 2008 and Nepali New Yorkers when I was doing my research. So again, hence my question about what happens when these two sort of frames of reference, diasporic frames of reference, sort of become significant. And thank you for that question. So yeah.
Okay, we're
I
getting
I mean,
towards wrapping up, but there are a couple more. I
okay.
mean, Marilena has made another comment, which she says it's actually what your talk is about is not so much arrivals as trajectories. And she's suggesting that you use trajectories rather than arrivals. I don't need to take that as a comment. You can think
Okay,
about it.
thank you.
And Sarah has commented about the significant difference in the cost of studying in the UK versus Japan. So yeah, I guess I dare say that that is definitely something to kind of look into. Is just what
Yeah.
the fee structure. Although there used to be. I don't think they survived anymore because the government had a crackdown. There were many colleges in the UK offering very cheap courses, which were transparently a kind of front for actually working. But mm,
The UK's branch colleges are everywhere, including, I mean, Hong Kong
yeah,
and Nepal too. So, one could do education intermediaries, UK education, American, it doesn't have to just do Japanese.
there's room for several PhDs on that. Yes,
Yes.
yes.
But thank you for that
Um,
question. And the trajectory, yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, thank you for that suggestion.
and Ranjit has given a link if you want to follow it up to creativenepal.info if you want to the
Ah,
Nepali
yes.
diaspora creating. And that does actually remind me of a book. I don't know if you know the book by Marie Gillespie about Southall in West London. So Southall is one of the oldest sites of South Asia. It's very close to Heathrow Airport. It's full of Punjabis.
Mm,
And she wrote a brilliant book. It's got a rather boring title, something like Television, Ethnicity and Cultural Change, but it's about
okay.
she worked as a teacher in Southall, and it's about the young people there and generational change and cultural change, and very much about creating a kind of new British South Asian culture that's transcends some of the kind of internal ethnic boundaries.
Is it Brick Lane,
No, that's
based on
different. Brick Lane is
Southall? There's a
no
long
Southall
one.
is Southall is
Uh,
West London. Brick Lane is East London. Very different
okay,
contexts.
sorry for my.
But
I should know this.
Brick Lane is
Okay.
Bengali, Bangladeshi, and Southall is
Okay.
Punjabi, very very strongly Punjabi, Sikh, and Hindu, and
Interesting.
a lot of
So how
Nepalis.
does I mean, I'm sure we can continue the conversation, but the South Asianization of Nepalis in the UK, how does that work? I've always been curious because obviously Nepali migration to the UK has a completely different trajectory. It's not the 1965, post 65,
No,
correct? It's
no. It's post
the
1990, mainly post 2000. Yeah, it's very different. Yeah, I think we'd have to have a whole nother
okay.
session on it.
Yeah, but no, thank
And
you for
other
this.
people here could
Yeah,
speak to it better than me. But yeah, okay. Well,
Creative
I think
Nepal
we should.
info.
I think we created Nepal.info. Yeah. So I think
Okay, thank
we.
you, Ranjita. Yeah.
So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for those who've contributed. Thank you, Tina, for giving us such a suggestive and really interesting presentation. And good luck with the third diaspora field site in the Hong Kong, which I'm sure will be very
Yes.
fruitful. And you should definitely, if you haven't already, meet up with our friend John Welton, who lives there. Um, and I'll
I
do an
have.
e-introduction for you. So let me
I
thank everybody
have.
who's been online on what is uh, well, momentous time for Nepal as well. So that will be a whole other question of how the diaspora is going to interact with this brand Naya Nepal in post election and a 30-year-old prime minister. You know, suddenly the age of the Nepali prime minister has dropped by about 50 years. Um, so just remains for me to urge everybody to tune in next month, same same Zoom link. The next webinar will be provisionally on, and this again relates to today's, but in us taking a more economic angle. It will be provisionally be on NRNs and the question of investment. So that's Saturday, the 4th of April. So put that 10 o'clock UK time, put that in your diaries, and I hope to see you next month. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gellner, Dr. Adhikari, and all the team and all the participants. Thank you so much for this engaging conversation. And it's getting late here, but I'm super energized to take some of the suggestions actually and look into it. Thank you again for this wonderful
We're all migrants of one
conversation.
kind or another. So thank you. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Bye bye.
Bye bye, everybody. Yeah.